Well, it is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for today, our dear friend Todd Fink. Todd Fink is the host of the KindMind Podcast and co-founder of the Giving Tree Band. His 2020 TED Talk, Beauty is in the Brain of the Beholder, and other songs and recordings have garnered millions of streams and inspire many around the world. He has had an album reach the top 40 on the Americana radio charts, and his podcast is a top show globally in the categories of philosophy and self-help. Todd has a degree in psychology from Georgetown University and is currently a graduate candidate at Columbia University in advanced clinical social work. He also holds certifications in addiction counseling and mindfulness teaching, along with 25 years of professional mental health work and motivational speaking. He's also one of our favorite speakers here. More at Todd Fink, michaeltoddfink.com. Todd, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be back, to be with you this Sunday. So thank you for our ongoing series. Thank you to everybody who shared today. Beautiful offerings, beautiful music. And I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about intuition. And I called it the science of intuition because there are some theories and ideas that I haven't talked about much yet that I think will be fascinating to explore together. And then in our conversation, see how any of those possibilities or theories match with the principles of spirituality or Course in Miracles about perception and our notions, our classical notions of time and space. Intuition is defined as the ability to know something immediately or to know something without proof. In the digital age, intuition may be taking a backseat because we have satellite GPS, so we just don't really think much about what we're doing. We have internet searches, and now we have artificial intelligence to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. However, its philosophical significance for our personal life and psychological growth hasn't really been diminished. It's still important to connect with intuition and to cultivate intuition, but I think it's just overlooked. So it feels, or we get the impression that it's a relic from the past. There is a good biological explanation for why we might call this a gut feeling. According to recent research at Johns Hopkins, scientists have demonstrated that we have as many as 500 million neurons lining our gastrointestinal tract, forming what scientists call the enteric nervous system, or ENS, or second brain. And this could partly explain why antidepressants may be prescribed for irritable bowel syndrome, which often includes emotional distress. The medication might be soothing symptoms by acting on those nerve cells in the gut. I'd like to walk you through some of the most infamous cases in American history of public intuition. The other day was 9/11 and a 23-year anniversary of the attacks on the World Trade Center. There was a special case of intuition. There were several, but one that stands out to me that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is that of Rick Rescorla, who was formerly in the military and also in the police, but at this time, later in his career, he was the director of security for Morgan Stanley at the World Trade Center, and he had a strong premonition that an attack could happen. This began sometime after the 1993 bombing. So you may or may not remember that this was actually the second occurrence of terrorism. He had urged his company to move its offices out of the tower altogether because he was concerned it could be a future target for no good reason or no apparent reason. And so Morgan Stanley didn't move, obviously, but Rescorla implemented regular evacuation drills prior to 9/11, which weren't common practices at the time. And on that fateful morning, after the first plane hit the North Tower, Rescorla immediately began evacuating employees in the South Tower, trusting his gut. His quick action saved many lives, although he tragically lost his own life when the second tower fell. He went back again and again to rescue more and more people. And his intuitive foresight and subsequent preparedness for this moment were key to saving more than 2,700 lives that day. If we go back a little further to the 70s, and American Airlines Flight 191 crashed shortly after takeoff from O'Hare and in 1979, and it killed all, I think, 273 passengers. But what made that crash notable in the realm of intuition was the sheer number of people who officially reported premonitions and vivid dreams about a disaster just before the flight. And in one of these cases, David Booth, a Cincinnati businessman, had recurring nightmares in the days leading up to the event. He dreamed of a plane spinning out of control and then crashing. His dream was so specific and recurrent that he reported his premonition to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Although his warning couldn't prevent the tragedy because there was nothing empirical about his intuition. But his intuition about the crash was eerily accurate. If we go further back to the Titanic, several passengers reported feelings of dread and unease before boarding the ship. And one such example was, I believe the person was Jessie Fairweather, who in the days leading up to the departure had this deep sense of foreboding. She felt so strongly that something terrible would happen that she decided to cancel her trip at the last minute, despite having a ticket, for no other reason other than this foreboding. Similarly, Captain Edward Smith, captain of the Titanic, he's often blamed in history for failing to reduce speeds, but he was under tremendous pressure to make historic times. He otherwise had a stellar maritime navigation career, but he reportedly told a friend a few weeks before the voyage that he had a strange feeling that it would be his last. And then there were some eyewitness accounts from people who survived that one of his last um, actions was saving an infant before he chose to go down with the ship. And finally, if we go a little further back in time, heroine Harriet Tubman, the key figure, one of the key figures in the Underground Railroad movement during American slavery, often spoke about following her inner voice or intuition when guiding enslaved people to freedom. She attributed her remarkable ability to avoid capture all those years to trusting her gut, which helped her make some very quick decisions about different routes and timing, when to stop, when to go. Tubman believed that her intuition was a form of divinity and guidance from higher power. And this enabled her to lead many people to safety, even with extreme danger and extreme stress. So I'd like to take this last story to just touch on the etymology of the word intuition. It comes from Latin intuit, which can mean tutor, to tutor, as you hear that tuit sound. But the the Sanskrit version of this, or contributing root, is the word antara, which means inner. It's used often in yoga to talk about inner senses or inner perception or inner experience, antara. So antara sounds similar to intuition or intuere from Latin. But if you put this together, we get inner tutor. When we think about the role of a tutor, the tutor guides, teaches, helps the student. The student, the tutor isn't the main teacher, but sort of a um, auxiliary support. I would imagine that a tutor cares ordinarily about the student, so they are friendly, and for the most part, they're they're just going to be there to help. But in a rare occasion, if the student is not listening, the tutor might need to raise their voice. So I think our intuition is always speaking, but once in a while it shouts. And that those are the instances where we remember in our personal lives, but also in history, because of the risk involved or the danger involved. And this voice that cares about us, that loves us, or that is speaking from our soul, needs to get our attention. And so we could think about this as three levels of knowing. We have instinct in the body. Those are codes like fear, hunger, loneliness, thirst, tiredness, based on our biological drives. And those are codes from our ancestors, because those codes worked well to keep us alive. I've often said that our code for hunger is too strong for the modern era. The degree to which we want food is based on the degree of difficulty in the hunter gatherer times. Now, with fast food and apps that do home delivery, bring food to your home, we have the problem of obesity. So there's instinct in the body. It's a way of knowing what we need to do with reflexes. There's intellect in the mind. This is the psychological knowledge that we get from empiricism. By acquiring experiences through the senses, we can think and plan and prepare. But subtler than this is intuition. And I like to think it's of the soul or the spirit, something metaphysical. Instinct is in the body, intellect is in the mind, intuition is in the soul. But some explanations for how this might work, some alternative scientific possibilities. One is pattern recognition. One key aspect of what I was talking about with the instinct is simply, as we go through our life, our brains accumulate vast amounts of data from our experiences. And when we are faced with a decision, our brain subconsciously searches through the files for patterns in this repository of information, allowing us to react seemingly spontaneously. This is why experts in a field often appear to have heightened intuition. They have more patterns to draw from. For example, a doctor may intuitively know what illness a patient has after only a brief interaction, because they've encountered similar cases before. If you ever watch House MD, you'll see this play out. Even if they don't immediately analyze all the details consciously, and that sometimes, like in the TV show, gets him into conflict with the other medical staff. Now, if we go down to the subatomic level, we have quantum entanglement and non-locality, which I don't purport to know much about, but I have been around physicists who do know more, and professors who worked closely with eminent quantum physicists like my neuroscience professor, Dr. Prebrum, and my brother was a physics major at Illinois State University also. So I've had lots of fascinating conversations about this. But one of the more speculative scientific explanations for the possibility of intuition as remote learning or remote knowledge involves quantum entanglement, which is the phenomenon in which two or more particles become linked in such a way that the state of one instantaneously affects the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. And Einstein humorously, and out of his doubt about this, called that phenomenon spooky action at a distance. Some philosophers and theoretical physicists speculate, this is on the fringe though, so I don't want to give the impression that this is any mainstream explanation, but they speculate that if consciousness is somehow connected to quantum processes, it might explain how information could be exchanged or known instantaneously across distances, defying those classical physical constraints on the speed of transmission, the speed of light. While this remains highly speculative, physicists like David Bohm have proposed theories of a quantum interconnected universe. There's a book called The Holographic Universe, which talks a lot about Bohm's theories, in which all things are fundamentally linked, even at vast distances, potentially allowing for information to travel through non-empirical means. He famously called this the implicate order, which means the universe is sort of enfolded on itself. There are different dimensions. There are ways to get across the universe, to travel across time, but we can't perceive it at this level of experience and through the limitations of the brain, which are programmed or coded to have a certain kind of experience at this scale. So I encourage you to listen to some of the, I think, more than 20 hours of dialogue with the mystic and spiritual philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti of India, who he maintained a long friendship with. And this is very fascinating because it's not ordinary in the history of quantum physics. And then there's the possibility of the collective unconscious that Carl Jung explored in his writings and in his diaries with patients. And the concept of a collective unconscious could provide a framework for understanding intuitive knowledge that bypasses the ordinary means of communicating and learning. Jung suggested that all of humanity shares a deep unconscious reservoir of knowledge that is sometimes manifested as archetypes, these patterns or themes or images, memories, and instincts that are inherited rather than learned. But Aldous Huxley, in his famous book, The Doors of Perception, hypothesized about mind at large, sort of like a cell phone is connected to the cloud. So it seems like it would seem impossible to be able to instantaneously listen to a song that was recorded somewhere else, but it's because it's linked to a cloud, which all the other phones are linked to. And even though it seems like it's on this phone, it's really expressing what's in the cloud. And maybe our brains are really a filter for mind at large. It's not that that's all that there is, but all that is sometimes channels through our limited minds. And he intuited this idea from his own psychedelic experiences on mescaline. Then the holographic universe theory is similar to what David Bohm was talking about. This holographic principle suggests that the universe might function like a hologram, where each part contains the information of the whole. So in a hologram, it appears that there's buildings or cars or whatever the hologram is an image of, But when you put your hand into it, you realize it's non-local and non-physical. It's all a projection of light. Therefore, anything that's in one part of the hologram is also everywhere in the hologram. And this theory, supported by David Bohm, implies that all the information in the universe could be stored and accessible at every point in space-time. But maybe certain points are more powerful, or are vortices or portals. In this model, intuition could be seen as simply, not simply, but magically, miraculously accessing this holographic information field, where the mind might tap into data that is normally hidden from us consciously. This might explain how individuals could just know things without having learned them through traditional means. It might even explain what we thought was past life experience, um, with a continuity about knowledge, where somebody has sort of prodigious or precocious inkling or proclivity towards some skill or some gift. My professor, Dr. Carl Prebrum, collaborated with David Bohm. That's how I know about some of this. And he took that idea of the holographic universe and the implicate order, and he applied it to his holonomic theory of brain function, which he then came up with an interpretation of quantum mechanics, suggesting that what we perceive as reality may simply be a projection on a deeper underlying level. And so Dr. Prebrum suggested that the brain doesn't just passively experience time and record information, but the brain itself is actively interpreting and reconstructing reality as deemed fit for the biocognitive system. So Prebrum's model also provided a potential explanation for this phenomena that are difficult to account for in traditional neuroscience, like intuition. But if the brain functions holographically, it may be able to access information in ways that aren't limited to linear processes of thought, allowing for intuitive jumps in understanding, or ESP, because a holographic brain could be part of a broader field of information and explain experiences like clairvoyance, or clairaudience, or telepathy, clairsentience. These are a few of the types of intuition. One day in class, Dr. Prebrum had a projector, and it was projecting an image onto the wall. Then he removed the lens, and that left just a blob of purplish light on the screen. And they took the lens and moved it around different areas of the beam of light. And what you would see was the whole image reappear smaller, depending on if he went further out. But his point was that he was demonstrating that every section of the light contained the whole, and the whole image also contained everything. And this is the holonomic principle. So this explains what he called non-local memory, memories stored in the holographic, or a brain that uses wave interference patterns, or Fourier transforms for mathematicians, would mean that damage to a specific brain area might not completely erase memories, because most people think each part of the brain does a particular function, and memory is happening, learning is happening specifically in the hippocampus, for example. But rather, it would just impair the ability to retrieve the information, as the information is stored everywhere in the brain. So if you think of, or if you've ever seen the movie Awakenings, I think that was from like the early 90s, with Robert De Niro and Robin Williams, who plays a doctor helping a dementia patient, maybe an Alzheimer's patient, or advanced Parkinson's. I can't remember exactly the dementia, but it's a true story about restoring memories lost by using other means like music and emotive inductions, and then the person, Robert De Niro in the movie, could remember. But if there's damage and the memories are lost, how is it possible to find these alternative methods, which happened historically in neuroscience, to retrieve what was thought to have been deleted, thus suggesting that maybe there is something to the holonomic theory. And then more far out is something I talked about in a episode with Dr. Mark Catella on the KindMind podcast about retrocausality, which means what it sounds like, that the present moment is not just influenced by the past, but it's also influenced by the future. In this, again, speculative framework, rather than the particles in quantum entanglement communicating faster than the speed of light, which would violate Einstein's theory of relativity, information could actually be traveling backward in time, as observed in the processes of quantum mechanics, because forward and backward actually have no meaning in quantum processes. There's a time symmetry. So effectively making the outcome of a measurement seem predetermined or influenced by a future event. So if the particles could speak, because they're both dancing in the future, they're entangled in the past. Okay. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's okay. There was a famous set of experiments, though, with this idea on the more psychological level. And at Cornell University, I'll just tell you a little bit about this. There's a social psychologist, Daryl Bem, who published a paper in 2011, I think, called Feeling the Future. And he did what he called retroactive priming. In traditional priming experiments in social psychology, participants are shown a stimulus, like a word or an image, before a task to prime their response to the next stimulus. But Bem reversed the order, testing whether seeing a word after a task would influence how participants performed on the task itself. And it did. For instance, participants were asked to categorize words as positive or negative, but the prime word that typically would have influenced their responses, which was shown to them after they had already completed the task. And surprisingly, the participants responded faster and more accurately when the future prime was consistent with the word they had categorized. This suggests that their behavior in the present was influenced by information from the future, which classically they could have no access to. So then he also did what he called a pre-sentiment and emotional stimuli experiment, which involves showing participants random images, some of which were emotionally charged, like violent or erotic images. And they were also particularly oriented or matched to the subject's sexual orientation, with the intention of being able to trigger arousal. And then other images are neutral. Bem sought to determine whether participants would exhibit physiological changes, like some changes in heart rate or skin conductance, moments before seeing the emotionally charged or erotic image, as if their body was reacting to a future stimulus. And that did indeed happen. This might also explain a very famous study called the Iowa card experiment, where different cards in a deck are mapped to or synced up with an electric shock. And researchers observe in the Iowa card experiment that people's bodies will react to the danger before a person's mind, which suggests that sometimes intuition is already present somewhere in our system. We just need to be able to cultivate it or unlock it. And maybe that is what some people do who we consider psychic or intuitive. They simply listen and they get in touch with it and they nurture it, or they live in families and cultures that's open-minded to it, or doesn't make these sort of ideas taboo. And so I'll just conclude with a couple indigenous cultures that I think have some of this understanding embedded into the worldview or their notions of space and time, like the Australian Aboriginal cultures, and in particular their concept of the dream time, which refers to a complex system of beliefs that through which they explain the origins of the whole world, but it also encompasses a nonlinear view of time. For those peoples, the past, present, and future are not seen as separate. Sort of like how Einstein said those are stubborn illusions in a letter he wrote to a grieving friend after a death. But for the indigenous people of Australia, they are interconnected and exist simultaneously. Dream time is their foundational period as well, and it's not like in the past. It's at a level of power where ancestral spirits shape the land, but these spirits continue to exist in the present and in the future. The dreaming is a timeless, eternal state that humans can access through rituals, stories, and dreams. So people have a relational connection to their ancestors, the land, and each other. One of the reasons why people in Australia advocated for human rights for a particular river, because it was considered a living ancestor and alive, and laws were passed to actually grant that particular river rights that humans have. It's a timeless domain, cyclical, not linear, meaning that events and beings from the past can influence us in the present, just as the present can affect the future, like in retrocausality. You might wonder with retrocausality, well, then why can't we just remember everything in the future? Why can't we have total precognition? Well, one way I think about this is if I asked you what you had for dinner 10 days ago, you probably don't know. But if I ask you something significant about your childhood, you might be able to remember it or recall it in great detail because of its influence. So similarly, we can't remember everything in the future because we don't have perfect memories. We can remember patterns perhaps from the future. So our gut feeling may be not something we can control, just as we can't really control that we remember trauma, that we have flashbacks of trauma, that deep wounds are difficult to move on from or to heal or to forget. Similarly, something very serious from the future may be difficult to truly shake from our gut feeling. And then in the Hopi tradition, our culture of the Southwest, their language emphasizes a cyclical nature of time. This was made famous by Benjamin Whorf when he was doing experience of linguistic relativity. He thought because he couldn't find, he was an expert of Mesoamerican languages, and he thought because he couldn't find language for time that Hopi people had a mystical experience, because when you introduce tenses in the language, you introduce tension. And the Hopi people historically are the most peaceful tribe of North America. But he attributed it, Whorf, the linguist, to how our language actually informs some of our problems. So tense, like I would have done this, you get guilt. Worry about the future, you get anxiety, but you have to have a language for that to be able to think about it in the mind. The cyclical nature of time and focus more on the manifestation of events in Hopi rather than this linear progression from past to present to future. So events are described in terms of whether they are becoming manifest or unmanifest. That's really beautiful to me because it's non-binary. It's not like this means also that the universe isn't entirely set, like the idea of a block universe where past, present, and future are all existing simultaneously, as Einstein described it as the block universe. But things are becoming manifest and unmanifest, and that might leave some flexibility for concepts like free will or transformation, or the importance, or emphasizing the importance of the choices that we make, rather than just something strictly belonging to the past or future. And so this reminds me, at least, of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or quantum probability in physics, rather than a purely deterministic set of processes, which can be depressing if you think about it, or that block universe. So we can't perceive it psychologically, but that doesn't mean that we can't access this knowledge, this wisdom, or even the transcendental experience where we know it, or we become it, or it manifests through us through mysticism, meditation, contemplation, prayer, but ultimately perhaps when we're no longer relying on the biocognitive system after what we think of as the physical death. So I will conclude here and look forward to exploring this further. Thank you.
And it's my pleasure to get the party started. I see Maureen has her hand raised. You know, I grew up in LA for 30 years, Todd, and I had the pleasure of listening to Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna and Ram Dass and you know, a lot of Eastern teachers and all that. I loved what you bring. You have such a depth of knowledge and study to it. My thing is more, you know, as a channel, and I've acted and do music as well and all that, is to bring the heart, you know, into the equation. And I'm sure you're familiar with heart math and, you know, some of their studies of working in meditation and how that's changed the energy in the world. And, you know, it just seems to me that love and our heart, where we're at emotionally, brings us into a whole other vibration in terms of what's available to our mind. Would you like to speak to that at all, my friend?
Sure thing. Thank you, Lou. And I think for musicians, this heart math and frequency and vibration really resonates with us, right? I'd say a few thoughts about that. There are, to understand frequency and vibration and resonance, frequency is measured in hertz in mathematics, which is cycles per second. How many times does something happen in a second? So there are fast cycles in music. When you strike the key of, or the note of A, on the piano, in the middle of the piano, if it's in standard tuning, standard Western tuning, that means it has a hertz of 440, which means the string goes up and down, completes the cycle 440 times in 1 second. Well, what's interesting about these frequencies in music, in the body has different cycles happening. There are all kinds of cycles. And there are also cycles at other levels, microscopic levels, in bacteria and microbes, and macro levels at the level of the celestial spheres. So there is a cycle of the moon cycling around the earth, of the earth cycling around the sun. And I've done some experiments with this with our music, where we try to make the music actually harmonious with cycles at other scales of size and dimension. And we would do this without the audience knowing that we have tuned the music differently, but it's in harmony with, let's say, the moon or the earth or the solar system. And we would actually have people come up to us and say something felt different, even though I saw this show the other night or something like that. So there's so much more to be explored. But meditation, emotions, they have different frequencies as well, different vibrations, which could contribute to our sense of intuition when we don't know through the more crude methods of exchanging knowledge.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Hi, guys.
My friend.
Hey, guys. Wow, that was awesome. And I invited a few friends to come to the talk, and I got a text during it that was like, Todd Fink is blowing my mind. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to it. But I was thinking about when you were talking about time and those extremely interesting experiments about like how future can impact the now. And, I'm driving through all of this really northern woods, big old trees. And I was thinking, well, yeah, it's kind of like the same way that the roots know about the branches and the branches know about the roots, even though they live in completely different sort of area codes and time zones. And then I was even thinking like, I feel like, and I wonder what your thoughts were on this. And I have two questions. I feel like, I mean, we so underestimate nature, but I feel like the seed intuitively knows its potential and its place in the pattern of things. So the seed of the apple holds within it that lineage. Last maybe a couple Sundays I was talking about how trees hold their lineage through the circles that we see when we cut them down. But that the seed, I suspect that it knows its lineage and it knows its possibility in the pattern of things, that it can become a tree, that it will, be recycled into more apples, that those apples will drop and fall to the earth, that more trees will, sprout. And I feel like sometimes we get so stuck in this linear bubble of time acceptance without really doing due diligence to the aspect of timelessness. And of course, in miracles, we say all the time, there is no time. We say all the time, there is no time, which is a funny thing to say. So anyway, so I wanted to hear what you had to think about that. But I also wanted to, when I was back in Hollywood, I would often have dreams of like booking the job that I had already auditioned for. And it happened so many times that it was so weird that I knew intuitively the jobs that I was going to book. And that it wasn't just that I knew it, but I was actually shown it in my dreams. And I bet you have some dreams. I'm pretty sure you've told me that you had dreams that like are intuitive dreams. And how does the intuition, and how can we work with the intuition in regards to our dreams? Those are my two questions.
Thank you. Oh gosh. Can I talk a little bit first about the tree metaphor? Because that really is inspiring. So that's a very good metaphor for this, because the roots are often invisible to us. If we think of our own life as a tree, the roots are like the past. We think the past is gone because you don't see it, right? But it's there underground. It's like now it's in a different dimension, so to speak.
Yeah.
We also think of the roots as our pain. And because that part of the tree's life is not pleasant. It has to fight, it has to break through rock, it has to tunnel through darkness.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the deeper those roots go, the taller the tree can be, and the better it can reach the light, right? So another way to think about this, I think, emotionally is the greater the sorrow, the greater the capacity for joy. And then it's also possible that we could think of this in terms of the intuition, where we could even scale that out to not our own life. But what if everybody in this Zoom meeting comprised the branches? There's not separate trees. And in many different wisdom traditions, the tree is the universe, like in Norse mythology. But also in yoga and other Eastern philosophies, everything comes from bija, which is a seed. And even in classical physics or cosmology, we talk about the Big Bang, meaning the whole universe sprouts from a seed. So we feel separate, and there's this tug of war between individuality and community. Maybe both are like two sides of the same coin. If we only thought of ourselves as community, people wouldn't take responsibility for their part in the cell of humanity. So we need individuality, but it's attenuated by community. Otherwise, left unchecked, that becomes destructive ego, like a cancer cell, which no longer is in service to the body, but would rather outlive the body. And so hoards resources, preserves its life beyond its lifespan. And that's what we actually mean by cancer. So these two forces aren't two different realities. They're the same reality, but when they're in harmony, we can have a spiritual experience. And so then what was the other question?
Thanks for that. And dreams, how they work
Yeah.
with our intuition.
So I think these quiet times, because obviously if we're dreaming, our body is quiet and still. I think accessing these other dimensions of our psyche is either a matter of something forcing its way intrusively into our consciousness, like a sense of dread all of a sudden, like in a place where we like, I have to get out of here. But otherwise, so that's what I meant by inner tutor. It's only going to shout if we're in danger. Otherwise, we just need the body to be still. Because when the body is moving, you're forced to react to the environment. So two things happen. Either the body's still and a person starts reacting to their memories and ruminates, or they are still and their mind gets still through breath control, and you can access different states of consciousness. It can be induced by other means, like maybe plant medicine, maybe the grace of somebody who is masterful at meditation, but otherwise it has to be cultivated. And anyways, dreams are sort of like the uh the manual. Every night we can get a glimpse into another dimension or the future or the past, because dreams happen when our ordinary thinking mind, which is addicted or attached to its beliefs about how the world works, sort of like as soon as you have a lucid dream, if you ever have a lucid dream where a person is conscious that they're dreaming, usually the same limitations come into play. A person believes they can't fly, so they might not be able to. So a second step in the process of lucid dreaming would actually being able to remove your limiting beliefs. But the purpose of that would then be to apply it into life. So I do think it's wise to keep a dream journal. I used to do that, because when you start to do that, your dreams don't dissolve so quickly. Only some dreams make it past the blood brain barrier, the dream wake barrier. Otherwise, you have to write it down. You can wake up going, wow, I'll never forget that, and literally 5 minutes later you can't recall it, because we've changed reference frames of states of consciousness. So a dream journal can help you to identify patterns, but also because of retrocausality, because in the future I'm going to write my dream down. In the past, when I'm dreaming, my brain will integrate it more into the memory structures, so I won't forget it.
Yes, amen. Retro causality. I just wanted to say that so I could sound kind of smart.
It's a fun word, isn't it?
It's so good.
Retrocausality.
The wisdom of trees, and thank you for breaking down and expanding the concept of trees. I've been writing a lot about trees and meditating a lot about trees lately. And also because I just came from Ireland, where it's my ancestral roots. And there's a lot of ancestral trauma. And I also wonder how that kind of works with the intuition. And I had this conversation just this morning where we were just sort of talking about this feeling of displaced grandchildren from Ireland, and how it feels so deep and so painful, and how we feel almost guilty for feeling it. And she also was saying to me that she felt guilty for having a good life after knowing that her ancestors came from famine and genocide. And I said to her, like, you get to be a living amends. Like, you can't feel guilty about having a good life, because you get to be the branches that make the roots, make their efforts worthy. So I don't mean to hog any more questions, but that was if you wanted to talk on that. And then I will have no more questions.
It's a great point about like ancestral trauma and epigenetic themes where we carry something from the genes of our ancestors. And if we're descendants of like of ancestors who went through a group trauma or historically awful event like war or Holocaust or slavery, that it could be like past life. It could be this sort of morphic field that we're kind of talking about with quantum physics. But there's been studies that have demonstrated that that anxiety about trauma does get passed in the genes. So there was a study with rats that were conditioned to fear acetophenone, which is a chemical that smells sort of like cherry or almond. And every time they would expose the rats to this chemical, they would give them a painful electric shock until they developed PTSD. So just like Pavlov's dog with the bell, the dog would salivate because he kept giving the steak after the bell, these rodents would start to have panic attacks before the shock came. So even if they never brought the shock out after the conditioning happened, they carried that trauma response, right? But the interesting thing about this experiment was 2 generations later, the grandchildren of those rodents had PTSD around the chemical, even though they had never been exposed to the chemical in their lifetime, nor the electric shocks. They would still have a trauma response. How does that happen? They went back and reperformed this experiment and found changes happened in the sperm of the male rats, that they think somewhere in those changes is some kind of code about fear. So fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's sort of like science nodding to the theory that form follows consciousness. And if your consciousness is like that, we can literally like rewire our genealogy through the way that we treat each other. That's fucking incredible.
It really is.
And it's incredible. It makes me want to cry because because you know
beautiful.
what? It makes so much sense. Yeah, it makes sense. And it kind of validates these feelings that we all have. You know what I mean? That we're still and in some ways
that's
we get
the
to be a
beautiful part, is the
generation.
validation that people aren't just crazy for feeling something that they can't pin it to an direct experience.
Yeah, and I think we're also the generation that is unfortunately conscious enough to actually get to deal with all of it. Like we get to deal with that, whereas our ancestors, even our last generation, they didn't have Oprah, they didn't have Ram Dass, they didn't have you, they didn't have all these tools to sort of wade through the congestion and scar tissue. So we just were like, just look the other way and make a joke. That's what the Irish are really famous for. You know what I mean? No offense to the Irish, I'm Irish, so I can say that. But that's how maybe the conscious was like, just look the other way, like just get through it, man. But now we're like, we're not willing to just get through it. Like we're not sieves. We want to understand it. We want to heal it. So anyway, I could talk to you forever, so I'm going to bow out.
Well, the other side of this really quickly though, because sometimes people say, well, I feel terrible because I went through a bad trauma and I don't want to pass that to my children. I don't want to continue that legacy of the anxiety that I have. And that's true also for addiction. Addiction is highly heritable trait. However, when people are spiritual, or just when people are open to therapy and to healing, that also gets passed along. So addiction doesn't just get passed to the offspring. Resilience to addiction gets passed along. And so if we remember that, it's a beautiful opportunity to say, I don't want to pass along pain or wounds, but if I could pass along resilience to the very thing that we're all vulnerable to, what a gift that becomes. So by healing, that's what's meant by healing ancestral trauma. There really is a ripple backwards and forwards, which don't really matter in the in retrocausality or in the quantum field or in the spirit realm. But that's why we heal our ancestors. That's how we heal our grandchildren, even though it seems like it's out of time.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Just gorgeous. Thank you.
Thank you.
So on that same theory, the 100 monkey theory, where the training and the thoughts and the problem solving, I never thought of that as intuition. I thought of that as more quantum, like you figure this out and it ripples along the waves of intelligence and problem solving. And then it's passed on to the point where they did those experiments where the monkeys in one island were able to, however, once they figured out something, it was passed on to generations across the sea. Mycelium, the 100 monkey, intuition, we're all talking about some kind of waves that you mentioned with those hertz. It is in the quantum ness of the consciousness that we, just because we can't see it, like the roots of the trees or the trauma that someone's gone through from the past, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And what my question is how do we harness that in the present now? We study every morning about the present now, and to let go of ego interpretations, overanalysis, paralysis, judgments, blocks. How do I get in touch with that now?
Great question. So that 100th monkey theory is is a Rupert Sheldrake thought experiment that explains amorphic resonance, and there was some version of this in the experiment I was alluding to where those rats in the trauma study developed these responses to the odor. Other rats that lived in those rats' lifetime in the same laboratory weren't part of the experiment, but they also started to develop PTSD because of their peers. So anyways, how to practice this? I think the most important thing with this, or one of the most important ways you can experiment with this spiritually in your life, is during hardship. Because we do not know what our present struggle means from the perspective of the future. There may be things happening and choices that we're making, even failures that we're committing in the present, that make no sense only in this limited context. But if you will allow yourself to be open about its value in beyond past, present, and future, I think you will start to see it. And the more you see it, the more you will trust it. And the more you trust it, the more you transform what suffering used to mean. And that is, I think, how we can transmute pain, is knowing that everything that we're feeling isn't just about our past choices and the present as we're classically trained, but that it has something to do with what we don't have immediate access to consciously about what we call the future. And if we allow that to unfold without the obsession, without the rumination, without the preoccupation, I think you start to see that the life lessons are happening on time, in time, in spiritual time, in divine timing. So experiment with that. Experiment with that today. What you're doing today, consider that it might have something to do with retrocausality. I'll give you an example. One Memorial Day, I was heading in to Chicago to go to a vegan restaurant by myself. Had the day off from work. I accidentally took the wrong exit, which led me to Lakeshore, where traffic was stopped because of the parade. And I'm like, oh, dang, I just lost 2 hours. And by the time I got through and out of that traffic and finally got to the restaurant, feeling like, why do I make such careless mistakes sometimes? I pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant and competed with a good friend of mine for the same spot who I hadn't seen in a couple of years. And she was about to move from Chicago literally the next day. So invited me to join her and her friend for dinner, and I did, and we caught up and had I not made the mistake in the past I would have missed that opportunity. So it's not like a life or death situation or anything, but it was an example. And I was also learning about retrocausality or studying it more at that time, which made it even more synchronous. So try it out.
I'm going to, and then I would like, my last question is, how do you relate intuition to spirit, or is there no correlation?
Well, I do relate it because when we speak of spiritual matters or spirit, I think what we mean is something immaterial, something like the holographic universe I was describing. Now, my intuition about it would be, in a hologram, you have a building, you have a car. That's what it's like to have a soul. Ultimately, there's no car in any holographic image that is totally independent of the rest of the light projecting the image. But you also can't say that there's no car, because there is a car. You can see the car. You just can't perpetuate the car as totally having its own reality that is not intersecting with the rest. So both could be true, that we're individuals, but like in Ubuntu philosophy of Africa, I am because of you. We are not, even if we're just physical beings, you can't be without air. Every particle in our body is circulated through all bodies, actually, I'm pretty sure, and maybe all bodies that ever existed before us, the particles. So even if we just confined it to a material existence, we're still sharing everything. So yes, we have a body, yes, we're an individual, but that individual appearance cannot exist even for a moment without everything else.
What do you think the relationship is between intuition and what the Course would call the voice of the Holy Spirit? And I'll take the question off here.
A softball. Thank you, Scott.
Well, I think it's a beautiful question. The voice is, the best language that we have, right? Because what word do we have for transmission from the divine? Or, so we come up with words like the voice of the Holy Spirit, or terms, or synchronicity, or manifestation, or retrocausality, because language can't actually comprehend, or can't actually can't express reality. It can only approximate reality. We have symbols, and the symbols aren't the reality. They're like the finger pointing at the moon, but the finger's not the moon. So in the Holy Trinity is God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Another way to think of that in Christian mysticism, and maybe in the Course, is that there's the universal power, there's universal consciousness, and there is individual consciousness, or there's God consciousness, there's Christ consciousness, and there's universal consciousness. So the idea that this one holographic universe has a top part, has the individual part, and has the intermediary, let's say. And because it's all, that triangle is one, well, one point of the triangle technically has access to any other part of the triangle, just like I have access to my hand right now, even though it looks 3 feet away. Does that make sense? In mysticism, another way to think of this Holy Trinity, which gives us access to divine knowledge or wisdom, would be that there's Ishwara in Sanskrit, which is the Lord, coming down from the crown chakra. There is the Guru, which is in the third eye, the Agnya chakra, and there is the Holy Spirit, which is the self. So another version of the Holy Spirit in most other wisdom traditions is the soul. And what I said earlier in the conversation kind of brings that together, which is instinct is in the physical body, intellect is in the mind, and intuition is in the Holy Spirit. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. Well, we could chat about this all day. This is absolutely wonderful, Todd. Thank you, as always, for sharing all this with all of us. I think we'll leave it there, my friends. That was a delight, and we'll hear from our musician for our final song, Olive McDonough.
Thank you, Todd. That was just fascinating. Such wisdom, like amazing. It could go on for days. Great chats. To finish, I am going to share a mantra using a sound bowl. So tuning into this relaxing vibration to end, and a mantra that brings us into inner peace. So this is a mantra that connects us to the element of water and is known to bring peace to the mind, which creates space. So I'm just going to invite you to breathe nice, long, slow, deep breaths. And by then calming the mind, allows the intuition to flow from this deep listening place. So enjoy. The mantra is called Sat Narayan, which translates to the true sustainer, which is water. Brings us into our Sat Nam. Sat da,